Welcome, everybody, to another episode of the Imagine Your Future podcast. Incredibly excited today for our special guest, Dr. Neelam Raina. Neelam and I met almost 2 months ago at an industry event. I had just done a keynote for a panel actually, on AI and how cool it was and everything. Went back to my table, met Neelam. She asked me some really great questions. And after I stuck my foot in my mouth about 3 times, I figured I better listen because she really knew what she was talking about. So Neelam, thank you so much for joining us. You want to do a quick introduction on who you are? Tell us a little bit about yourself.
Hi, Stephen. Thank you for inviting me. I am an academic. I am a specialist on post-conflict reconstruction of societies. And as a researcher, which is what I do, I sit on university ethics committees. And so data is of great interest to me, but the process of gathering it is also a big process. And at university, these committees are looking at how and why we do this. So that's my work. And I work in South Asia in war zones. So data and what it means on the ground is very important to what I'm able to do and what others are able to benefit from.
That's amazing. I knew you had supported a lot of different issues, poverty issues, women issues, et cetera. I actually didn't realize that you were working in war zones for a lot of the work that you were doing with post-conflict resolution. I think we should probably even discuss that as well, Neelam. Let's jump right in, though. So when we did when we had the discussion at dinner, we had really talked a lot about artificial intelligence, next generation AI, generative AI, sort of all of the changes that were taking place. And the panel was quite inspirational because I think we all walked away with, these are all these cool things that could happen and how disruptive and transformative and great it would be for society. And I think you had a really different perspective. And I think you really kind of nailed it and talked about, does disruption really cause inequality, or does disruption support or help inequality? And that was really sort of the basis for our whole conversation. Tell us more about your thoughts there.
I like the way disruption as a word and an idea is understood in the tech world. And as a non-techie, disruption is a word that we almost fear in many ways, because disruption exacerbates inequalities in real-time situations, which means that the ability to change something radically at a quick speed will have a fallout, which is not always positive for everybody. And if we kind of take a zoom out and take a big global picture for a minute, you will see that inequalities in our current world are accelerated, one half of the world going in one direction and the other half going in the other, in terms of access, in terms of resources, in terms of money, education, access to health, all those kind of big global challenges that we press up against. And so when the perspective is different, because when you talk about disruption, how does the fallout of disruption excite some who were there in the room with us for that dinner? But how does the manifestation of disruption have influence on the everyday of those who have no say in that disruption? So do we at any point of time through Gen AI accelerate global inequalities? And how does that get watched or governed or regulated by those who are watching all of us?
I think that's like the idea of ethical AI or ethical, let's call it ethical disruption, but I think AI is the one, that topic that I'm probably most familiar with these days. And what I'm hearing you say or imply, I guess, is that if we're going to have these kinds of technologies, they have to be responsible. Can you talk to me a little bit about how you think you can build ethical AI? Is it possible?
It's I think if we can build AI, then pretty much everything is possible. I think so. If I break this into 2, really, the ethics of the outputs or outcomes or your goals as a business or where you want to reach as a business outcome, those ethics we understand maybe a little bit more and we know right from wrong, and we at least acknowledge the presence of the gray. It's the other side of it where data is being crunched or fed into machines that has ethical implications that seem quite woolly at the moment. I've been looking at AI ethics policies that are coming out from all over the place. Every country seems to have one. Europe seems to have developed one very quickly and updated it. But the implications of that data itself, and this is what I was talking to Steve about, that data might be robust enough to be fed into whatever eats it and chomps it out the other side. But is that data, are there biases in that data? Does data of those who have access as data producers or data points, what about those who don't? So in a digital world, if I am not on the grid, not digitally connected, do I then get effectively deleted from these technologies and their benefits or harms? And how do we regulate or think about the ethical implications of that? Data on itself, and we were talking about this book that Steve has also read called Invisible Women. And we know just on the gender line, there are ethical implications of the gender biases that all of our data includes. And a very good quick example would be the use of statin in treating diseases and how that drug is built for men. White men have been tested with it. How does healthcare and health access be informed by, how are they informed by the data that drives that decision making? And how biased is that data along the gender lines? And if I add the racial implication to it, how does that affect it? So as we feed data of any kind into AI, how sure are we that data is sound and correct before we start picking up its insights and applying it through our own decision-making systems strategically? So ethical implications are large, but they're fixable as long as we acknowledge what we don't know. The known unknowns we know about, but the unknowns that become invisible as technology drives innovation, what about those people? What about those issues and those challenges? And so it's effectively resolvable only if we acknowledge the elephant in the room.
I think you're spot on, Neelam. That you said something really interesting right at the beginning of that section. And you talked about the haves and the have-nots, whether it's economic, whether it's education, whether it's access to health, money, sort of the core things, if you think about Maslow's, that drives all of us to protect our families and other things. And one of the things that's happening with AI and the large language models and all the tech that we're using to create them is sort of this understanding that the world is online. So we have literally billions and billions of data points on people to be able to pull into these models to make, assumptions, estimates, generate things, right? And one of the studies that I saw that was interesting is, I think this was with Dolly. You asked Dolly to provide a picture of a software engineer. And I think it was 98% of the time, Dolly would provide a picture of either a white male or Asian male, mid-20s to mid-30s, stereotypical, if you will, software engineer, right? And it was happening over and over. But I think what you're saying is it's even more fundamental to that, because many of the people that could be most disrupted may not even be online, may not even have their data represented in a meaningful way that they can be represented. So how could we make sort of this new Gen AI, new access to tech, more uplifting, where we bring more people up, not further the divide that I think you rightly are discussing?
There are two ways of doing this. One, like I said, acknowledging those who are not included and understanding why they are not included. For example, let's just talk about the fact that despite the 7 languages I speak, we are having this conversation in English. ChatGPT, that has suddenly raised the profile of what AI is supposedly supposed to do for you, is in English. There might be translations, of course, but those who we leave behind, for various reasons, whether they are not part of the digital world, whether they cannot afford to be part of the digital world, and the female male, the gender-based bias about accessing the digital world and what it implies. Those kind of micro differentiation and the barriers to accessing digital is one big question that can be addressed through policy changes, which are quite rapid. But if you think of the fact that the data we currently hold that is being used rapidly, what about issues of privacy and, consent and, worker autonomy, surveillance? What about those kind of implications? In many ways, the smartphone, the phone that I have, the application that I download, shift the responsibility of, do I consent to this? Do I agree to that, to me as an individual? But at what point have I been educated, empowered, told in simple words what this means for me? I can jump onto a phone in India and be part of the hip crowd that has the latest iPhone. But do I really understand the data that the iPhone collects from me? Am I okay with it? Am I okay to be seen as a data point on which experiments will be done as it processes AI? Do I have a say? Will I ever have a say in this? Or does my say not matter because I'm not a significantly important individual in the larger picture?
I think at the macro and the micro level, I think about it slightly different. At the micro level, I absolutely agree. Data privacy, rights, how are you going to be targeted? What does that really mean? What's the education associated with that? At the macro level, the good that can come from understanding the collective, if you will, insights, whether it's micro payments or financial transactions or health or all the things that we now collect, allow us, I think, to provide better services, better healthcare, better understanding of it with the use of technology. Now, you may be sitting there shaking your head right now because I know that sounds like a techie utopian, but it does feel to me as if at the macro level, pulling this data together, pulling these insights together, allow us to power things that we're seeing with whether it's Watson or Gen AI or ChatGPT or anything to make these amazing discoveries. But we have to do this in a way where it's better represented.
Absolutely. I think better representation pulls in the micro aspects of it, of course. But a techie utopia, as you were saying, of course it is possible. Of course it will be wonderful. And why should we hold back from seeing and exploring where we get to and how we can make everything a better place? But I will throw the word capitalism in there just for the sake of argument. What was the last good thing that we did with capitalism that benefited everybody? But again, providing better services. If the purpose of something that is being designed using Gen AI is to provide better services, then that is your conversation point as strategy saying, right, I need to do something that has a meaningful benefit to others in addition to capitalism in my pocket. But if I am developing things that prevent others from accessing meaningful work at some point of time and, meaningful work, making a difference, self-actualization, all of those human values and principles that we put in front of our websites, does that macro level thinking account for those larger human principles? At what point of time are you going to take a decision of a 1 or a 0 that will make a benefit in the immediate to provide better services along the lines of business development and profit making? And at what point of time are those better services being critically evaluated by those who are actually benefiting from those services? So I can understand the value in healthcare, a better diagnosis, a better treatment, a faster response to a disease where it could potentially disrupt your life entirely. Great. But does that come behind a very expensive insurance check? And how are you using AI to check if I am worth insuring or not? At what point of time are we handing over decision making to something that we cannot? I sound like a technophobe. I'm not, I promise. As how are we giving over a decision-making process that we actually cannot see or understand? Or maybe we can, but we cannot explain. You cannot explain to me how AI is using multiple algorithms to give me an answer, that it's a perfect answer. If we cannot see that decision making, how are we then balancing this out against the provision of the better services for which it was designed? At what point do we have any checks and balances? And the problem with the way we think is we think of regulation as something that holds us back, that prevents us from going into the blue ocean and the blue sky and doing what we think we can do and testing unexplored territory. However, with AI, we also question the structure of regulations and how they are built, how they are designed, and what frameworks have been used. All of these are out of the window with AI. These regulations or these checks that make sure that the purpose of the experiment or the purpose of this Gen AI usage is A, B, and C. If you arrive at D, are you going to sense check it against the end user to see if it is of value, or will you let it take you where it wants to take you? And in that little gap between C and D, are there any black holes that we can get sucked in that can do harm? If the do no harm policy is applied to regulation, then perhaps we have a different framework. We can see the benefits very quickly, but can we see the things that don't count as benefits and all the way down that spectrum into actual harm? We need to be aware of that macro level actual harm possibilities and mitigate against that. They're not unresolvable, but we need to acknowledge that they exist.
So what I'm hearing both you and Steve say in your discussion of, the macro level and the micro level is I would kind of divide it a different way, but using some of the words that you just said. I think there's an ethical AI, and the ethical AI is really, circles around our values, our social economies, those kinds of things, and more tactical AI to pick up on what you said, Neelam. It's the way we develop the tools and the technology and have visibility into the development of the tools and the technology that drive AI, because we want AI to be, inclusive. We want it to be explainable. We don't want that mystery that you were just talking about. We want it to have a positive purpose, which is, I think, where regulation can come in, and we want to use data responsibly. So rather than macro, micro, I see it as really ethical and tactical when it comes to how AI is disrupting, to use your word, Steve, everything that's going on. And that it doesn't make necessarily room for the people who are left out. So I think that's a problem that we still have to solve, how people are being impacted by AI who basically have no influence over it. Does that make sense?
Yes, it does. It does. And I think that the nail on the head with data responsibly. Yeah, and its inherent biases. And if you were to process something that is AI through a university ethics committee, the first question it will ask is, do you have humans with who you're working as part of your sample group or your, testing group? And if the answer is yes, the form just doubles in size. So when you are talking about data responsibly, you're also talking about data that is collected responsibly and designed to be collected ethically too. It goes backwards along that responsible use of data. And that implications are very wide, again, along the inequality access lines, but also that implication, when we start valuing what AI will give us as a result or an output, along which we'll make decision making, the veracity of that data and its unbiasedness are key points for you to be able to use that data responsibly. And we were talking about this at dinner, what do you need to ask a bot, a chat GPT type of thing? Are we training ourselves to ask the right questions? Or is it training me by giving me the wrong answers till I can frame the right question? That critical awareness of me as a human trying to get to where I need to get to rests entirely on sound ethical data being used to answer my questions. And that data responsibly makes a lot of sense. Yes, I agree with you.
We have to trust the data. We have to be able to trust, I think, for this to be of significant value to us. And I'm sorry, Steve, I cut you off.
No worries, Karen. I think that you triggered another thought, so let me go to that thought first, and then I'll come back to my other one. I think part of what I'm hearing Neelam say, and the root may be part of this, is there's a whole broad percentage of the underserved where we don't even have data. We don't have insights. So if I'm trying to create a drug, and that drug is to fight breast cancer, right? Or to address breast cancer, then there's a high probability today that study is going to be very biased by a collection of people probably in the Western world that have these characteristics, and very underrepresented of people in other parts of the world that may have just as higher thing, but because of access to healthcare, access to better diagnostics, et cetera, we won't even know within those data sets. And so when you look, and this is one of the key things that I really got out of Invisible Women, or which I thought was fascinating, how we look at data has to be considered in so many ways. But I think, Neelam, if I'm reading you right or hearing you correctly, it really goes back to even what's in the sample set. And do we have enough things to really say this is good or this isn't good? And then how do we solve that? How do we get over that divide on just the lack of data, lack of insights, the things that the big LLMs or the big AI machines need to be able to do more good or do no harm, depending on perspective?
I think that sample size and the training of those who gather this data or identify your data point, not a techie, so I'll put that card out. But how do you decide the sample set? Who's deciding whose data is being collected? And who have you chosen as a respondent and not the other? At what point are those decisions being made? And earlier we had used the word inclusive. If we apply the concept of inclusion entirely to these sample sets, a lot of them will be found wanting. Because sometimes we gather the most easy to access data because it just makes more sense. Right? So easy access points, finding the usual suspects from which data emerges is easy. But if we have technology that does better than just that, then we should be able to fix where we get data from. But also, if nothing else, is there a caveat with that data set that says, for example, this drug has been tested on women in the West only, in the US, northwest of the US only? Can we add a caveat so that those users who are going to run with the outcomes of all the insights from this data are aware of the shortcomings of the sample size? Is that a quick fix problem? Maybe. Does it solve the larger picture? Perhaps not. How we look at the data has to be considered, but how do we train those who are picking up this data to understand that the data will have inherent biases, as do the humans looking at it, but perhaps the machine doesn't? And how do we make data more inclusive? If we understand, there are bigger principles around it, and there's decolonization to look at. There is gender inequalities, all those paradigms of inequalities that somehow are also represented in the SDGs. How are we making sure that the sample set that you're working with is mindful of those exclusions? Nobody's going to smack your wrist to say, hey, you forgot about this one. But if you know that you did not include somebody, would it then be ethically correct to put your hand up and say, look, this is only relevant to this set?
Yeah, I think doctors and pharmaceutical and science in general, throw them in a good bucket for right now, will use, statistical process control, SPC, other methods to really make sure that they have a good sample set, et cetera, and do that. But let's take an example of much more meaningful. Let's take an example of somebody getting credit and what's their credit worthiness, and using AI to generate ideas around somebody's credit worthiness for, microloans, or even the example of trying to use AI in job hiring. What makes somebody a great candidate, or somebody, that has, access to education? Those 2 to 3 use cases seem to have could have serious consequences in your model on furthering the divide, because I may not have the right profile for a specific role or specific education or for a specific loan. And my data set could be completely biased on how I even think through those decisions. And now you're making even more meaningful impacts to the individuals because of those. Thoughts on how we sort of think through that, and what are the types of things we need to consider?
I think with microloans, which have been around for a while in developing countries, the whole process of validating a customer, in inverted commas, who's worthy of a loan has traditionally was around the lines of, I know your grandfather, I know what land you have, I can, think about it as your assets that can be loaned against. But when a credit rating is transparently, if I run my credit rating through an online website, it will give me whatever rating I want or whatever rating I was expecting. But I know that it is looking for specific things which I can see on the website. It'll kind of run against my credit cards and whatever loans I might have, and then arrive at a conclusion. But when you shift AI into it, again, the process of decision making becomes opaque. And there is a liability there of AI, or should be one AI, to making the wrong decisions for people. But our faith in technology is, I think, perhaps second to God or first above God, maybe in many ways, where a computer cannot be wrong is a philosophy that is, I have seen happening on the ground many times. It cannot be wrong. It's telling you the right thing. If we keep that trust in technology, then the implication of a poor decision along, supposing credit loans category of thing, can be extremely huge. And we know that they will be biased against women in any case, because the data that is chomped through these banking systems is generally male-driven data at any point. So we know that it is going to be a biased result. Perhaps it might be a good idea to do a pilot test research point here, where you're going to double-blind peer review what's happening on these decision-making points, and can we spot the error? We could find these data points and we could feed some faulty data in and see what happens. But in terms of job hiring, again, the human biases that exist within job hiring, along gender lines, of course, but also along other lines, along race, along age, against, where did I do my PhD from? When there's AI in that process, the candidate who did not get selected at no point of time understands why they were not selected. They will get a reluctant, sad, I'm really sorry kind of email or whatever. But at no point of time do we know against which parameters they have been judged. Does my social media footprint get picked up by these AI machines looking at job hiring whether I'm the right candidate to recruit? Of course it does. Do I know about it? Yes, I'm married to a techie, I know about it. But would I have otherwise? Not at all. So how are we being judged for something that will improve our lives that we have decided to do by something that might have the wrong data or might actually be using a process that we don't understand? So if I go to a bank and I say, what else do you need? They will say, okay, we need a £2,000 more secured against your name before we will loan. Fixable problem or a solution perhaps to that decision. But does that happen in the credit rating space if you use AI? I don't know.
Yeah, I mean, the challenge is, and you've nailed it, the hiring manager or the recruiter or the bank teller or the loan officer probably doesn't even know, because it was a black box algorithm that came back and did even put that individual or that loan in front of you. And so it can accelerate the piece. I mean, there's so much good that can come out of it, but I think the concerns that you're raising are really things that we need to think about from, both a broader data collection standpoint, analysis perspective. And we're getting close on time, but I'd love to have you back again, because there's this whole thing about how do we even ask questions? And I love your line, are we training it or is it training us? Mm-hmm. And if it's training us, maybe that's not a good thing, right? Our education systems still have, a huge role to play in who we are as individuals and how we think. So you don't necessarily want to turn that over to an AI engine as well to teach us to get the answers that we want versus, seeking the truth. Karen, let me throw the last one to you. This is fascinating. Could go another hour, but I recognize we're coming up on the time.
Yeah. No, I'm probably more aware now of, I was coming into this conversation thinking we were going to talk about the ethics of AI and relate it to everyday things like students using it to write papers or the current strike in the movie industry where people are afraid that their images are going to get co-opted. But it's not really about that. I'm thinking it's all about the data. And I find that fascinating. And just to go back to kind of the key words that I'm taking from the conversation is AI's got to be explainable. To your point, Steve, if someone's getting excluded from getting that loan, why? The black box algorithm, we don't know. We can't explain it. And I really think we need to figure out what the guardrails are for using data responsibly going forward. So I think that's where I'm at. But there's so many other things to talk about. So I would really appreciate it, Neil, if you would come back for another session, because I think Steve and I both have a lot more questions. Steve, you want to wrap, or do you have one more thing that you want to ask?
No, I would just like to say again, Neelam, thank you so much. We'll actually give you the final word. I think I'm going to stay a compassionate capitalist and still think of the good, but you have definitely opened my eyes to some key things that are important on how we go forward with this technology.
Thank you so much for having me. I think the final say I have is that to just synthesize what we've discussed and what I've been thinking, the final say would be that we have the ability to do a lot of good. We should also have the ability to look at the harm we can do and the exclusions and divisions we can create. We have, it's almost like a portal. We are entering into a portal and we can take some decisions before we go into it and come out the other side. It's very important we are mindful of everybody, not just those who are inside the digital space, and mindful of what we already know of the inequalities we live with in 2023. And do harm that we might not live to regret, but which might come sooner or later.
Thank you so much, Dr. Neelam Raina. This was a wonderful conversation, and we look forward to talking to you again. And to the listeners, we look forward to speaking to you too.